welcome to the Dr. America Show. I am your host, Dr. Sanjeev Sriram, and thank you very much for joining us. Before we dive into today's topic, I wanted to take a moment and talk about a concept called nothing about us without us. Nothing about us without us. This phrase came up in America during the 1990s when disabled Americans were advocating for their rights, and I personally learned about it when I heard the testimony of a one Miss Tiana Gaines Turner from the group Witnesses to Hunger. She testified last spring before Congressman Paul Ryan's committee during a hearing on poverty in America. She was the only person out of all the hearings that Congressman Paul Ryan had about poverty, and out of all the testimony that was given, Miss Tiana Gaines Turner was the only person in that series of hearings who had actually struggled with modern American poverty firsthand. In describing nothing about us without us, Ms. Gaines Turner was telling Congress that they should not be making big decisions about programs meant to help poor families without the insights and perspectives and experiences of people who use those programs to keep their heads above water. Nothing about us without us. I want to make sure that Dr. America our show embodies that principle. I'm going to do my best to invite guests who are, living at the front lines of the issues that we discuss. And, last week I interviewed Eric Sheptock, a man who advocates for homelessness in D.C., and, he has, unique credibility because he has been homeless himself. And, he knows firsthand how good intentions and empty rhetoric are essentially useless if the agencies and the organizations that have to carry out the work are not actually, putting practice into purpose and practice together. And as much as possible, we here at Dr. America are going to make nothing about us without us part of our work ethic. And when we talk about issues, our guests are going to be from the front lines of those struggles. And I'm really, really looking forward to it. I think that this is going to be a fresh new way of talking about health policy, health politics, such that we're not just talking about people who are struggling, but we're actually including them as much as possible in our conversations so that we can be better informed and that we can actually hold ourselves and the powers that be accountable for the work that needs to get done. Okay, and all of this is actually especially important for today's topic, reproductive health. When it comes to talking about reproductive health and women's health in America, a huge part of the problem in the conversations is that too many men are doing the talking. And even though I'm a progressive, and even though I have my views that are rooted in the scientific consensus of thousands of women's healthcare providers, I recognize that I am yet another man talking about the health experiences of women. So whenever we talk about reproductive health on Dr. America, and I assure you that this is going to be a topic that we're going to keep coming back to again and again and again because it's just that important to the health of our country. I'm going to do my best to share the leadership of the conversation with women and actually try my best to follow their guidance on how these conversations need to go, where they need to go, what they need to address. Simply because if we're going to disassemble that patriarchy and actually manifest equality, for voices and share power, then we need to do that, in our own house. And it's not enough just to, point the fingers at the opposition. We need to kind of make sure that we are living through with our own principles about what equality and shared power in America is supposed to mean, especially when it comes to health policy. Nothing about us without us. We're going to make it happen. Okay, so when it comes to reproductive health, I think it helps to, acknowledge the facts and figures. And, I know the statistics are dry and they might not be the most fascinating thing to talk about, but the reason why I like to kind of use this as a starting point is that we need to recognize the truth of the trends. Because when it comes to some of the ill-advised and ill-informed and just straight-up misogynist policies that are being debated in the Congress and in our state houses across the country, a lot of the people who are pushing those pieces of legislation, who are pushing those bills, they're depending on ignorance. They are depending on the prejudice of people who are wanting to shame women, who are wanting to shame sex. And I think that it's important for us to recognize what are the true statistics, what are the trends that we are looking at, so that we can see where we are, where we've been, what might be explaining some of these trends, and make policies that actually support our health and not our prejudices. So let's dive into some of these numbers. Okay, the first bit of news to share is that there are fewer abortions happening in America. This is good news. In 2008, there were 1.21 million abortions that were performed, and in 2011, there were 1.06 million abortions, and that's a 13% decrease. Now, the anti-abortion, anti-choice crowd is going to tell you that this decrease happened because, they got tough on, abortion providers, they got tough on women seeking this procedure, and they made it harder and harder for this health service to be provided. That's not quite true. The thing about this decline in the abortion rate is that there's also this decline in the birth rate, like the number of births that were happening. So, the thing is that, when you look at the decline in the abortion rate and you look at the decline in the birth rate, what it simply means is that women were not getting pregnant as often as before, and there were a few more options for how women could control their reproductive fate. And a lot of that, a lot of the trend in those statistics between 2008 and 2011, and even before that, the decline in the abortion rate actually has more to do with the improvements that were being made in contraception and the more options that are being opened up to women to pick and choose from, so that healthcare providers and women can work together to kind of find the right kind of contraception for each woman's health, given the context of their health. And it's actually, I feel that the decline in the abortion rate is actually more of a success story of contraception, but we do have a lot more work ahead of us to keep contraception available and affordable to women everywhere. And that's not to say that abortion is not a major issue and that it's over and done with. We still have a long way to go for helping women avoid unintended pregnancy. And that's because at least half of American women experience an unintended pregnancy by the age of 45. And when you look at who is having abortions in America, a lot of if you listen to a lot of the lay press, what they're going to tell you is that that it's mostly teenagers and that they're out of control. But when you actually look at the numbers and you look at the statistics that are being gathered by different organizations, including the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, whom I rely on for almost all of my statistics, what it shows is that, women under the age of 17 barely make up, they're not even making up 6% of abortions in this country. It's mostly women who are in their, mid to late 20s. And when you look at their reasons for why they sought out the procedure, it's because they're doing their best to actually take care of another child that they had just had, or maybe even two children that they had just had. Many of these women, and then when I say many, I'm talking about at least 3/4. Like the numbers range from anywhere from 70% to 75% when women list their reasons for why they chose to terminate a pregnancy. they're trying to, be better mothers to the children that they already have, or they're trying to, improve their socioeconomic situation by completing school or, climbing the ladder of a job that they're in. A lot of them are also just looking at their domestic situation, and they're not really sure whether the father of the would-be child, the man that got them pregnant, they have their doubts about whether this is a person who's going to stick with them and be a father. They're unsure of their mate. They are looking at, situations in their own home which are just not really conducive to being a parent. And as a pediatrician, I can tell you that when women make these kinds of choices and when they are doing their best to make sure that their pregnancies are wanted pregnancies have a way of becoming wanted children. And, they become healthier pregnancies. Like, the kids do better, their health outcomes are a whole lot better. I've watched women who have bit the bullet, really tried to go through with a pregnancy that they had no intention of actually becoming pregnant, and they struggle. They struggle throughout the pregnancy. They struggle to provide for the child when they're born, and the child's health is paying for it, the mother's health is paying for it, and at the end of the day, actually, a lot of society is paying for it. So, when I look at reproductive health, I'm actually kind of seeing it on both ends. I'm seeing, moms with new babies who were unprepared, for motherhood and a lot of the consequences that come along with that. And then I'm also looking at, at teenagers, becoming young women and trying to chart out their reproductive destiny. And they're looking to doctors like me and, my colleagues and OB-GYN to help them find a path that is going to keep them healthy, keep their choices as their choices. And at the end of the day, this is, their individual health at stake first, and then our society's health is actually, at stake also, because we do better when women are given the trust and, guidance to make these reproductive health choices. So, I just wanted to kind of, help put some of these numbers and some of these trends into context. I think that there's still a lot of work to be done. And so for today's show, the way that I wanted to kind of, leave the discussion, the path that I wanted to go on, was to bring our first guest, Ms. Shauna Thomas. She's the co-founder and co-executive director of Ultraviolet, an incredible organization. If you guys haven't heard of them yet, you got to check them out online. They're doing fantastic work for all kinds of different women's rights, including reproductive health. I'm going to talk to Shauna about the stage that is being set for women's health in our Congress and the attacks that are already happening. My next guest will be Tanine Allison. She has worked for Planned Parenthood Texas Votes, among many other advocacy projects that Tanine has worked on. But she's going to help us understand, where the attacks are coming from at the state level, because, there's the federal threats to women's health, and then there's a lot of, it just blew my mind, the levels of threats that are coming from the State House. So to help us kind of make sense of a lot of this, we've got two fantastic guests. I'm really excited to bring them, on the program. And for all of us to learn from them. And we're going to have Shauna come and talk to us right after these messages. Thank you so much for tuning in. This is Dr. America, and I am your host, Dr. Sanjeev Sriram. We'll be right back.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.
All right, welcome back. This is the Dr. America Show. I am your host, Dr. Sanjeev Sriram, and today we are covering reproductive health in 2015. Where are we at? Where are we going? And to guide us through the national picture of where reproductive health policy is heading, I'm really thrilled to introduce our next guest. She's Shauna Thomas, co-founder and co-executive director of Ultraviolet, an organization of women and men fighting for women's rights from politics and policy to media and pop culture. Shauna has had a 10-year career in progressive organizing, building progressive infrastructure projects, and winning critical policy fights at the national level. Before founding Ultraviolet, Shauna was executive director of the P Street Project, a 501c4 nonprofit dedicated to organizing progressive members of Congress and connecting federal legislative strategy with online grassroots mobilization efforts. And before that, I met Shauna when she was the COO of Progressive Congress, a nonprofit supporting the policy and organizing work of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. She's been involved with advocacy since the 2004 presidential election and has inspired a lot of young people to be mobilized. And we are thrilled to have her here on the program. Shauna, thank you so much for joining Dr. America today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm sorry that was a bit of a mouthful.
It's all good. It's all good. So before we get too far into the ridiculous legislation being proposed in the now Republican-controlled Congress, I want to start on a little bit more of a positive note, and that is what we achieved for women's health in America in 2014. Before we can really go on the offense to stop some of these non-scientific and misogynist policies that the 114th Congress wants to try and pass, I think it would help our listeners if we could remember what we're defending in our 2014 accomplishments. So,
sure.
Yeah. So what does Ultraviolet want to remind us?
Well, look, 2014, like 2013 and 2012 before that, were certainly years in which we saw some very aggressive attacks on women's health at the state level. But what and actually introductions of more bills that undermine women's access to health probably in those 3 years than any other time of our history, maybe, well, not combined, but certainly any other time in our history. And what that did was a couple of things in terms of how it helped us actually really raise consciousness in this country about the reality of the kinds of attacks that the far right wing of the Republican Party is making against women and the impact that it's having on women's lives. And because we were able, and lots of other groups were able to kind of point to what was happening in the states, and we're able to lift up the stories of real women whose lives were being impacted by restrictions around birth, whether it was birth control or most often it would be around access to abortion or Plan B in some cases, or the morning after pill. If you don't know what Plan B is, we were able to galvanize a lot of people. So that the net impact was, okay, look, what is happening is not, it is real. This is not some philosophical debate happening among elites between the Republican and the Democratic parties. This is not something that's just happening kind of at the federal level that comes up just around an election to help candidates define their values or to appeal to a certain narrow demographic in their party. This is what's been happening, this debate that's been brewing, since Roe v. Wade, for instance, about whether or not women should have access to abortion, has actually taken a much more aggressive turn, and is hitting women in the pocketbook, and it's hitting women's lives directly, and it impacts their lives, everything ranging from whether they can get a job, to whether they can finish school, to how they feel about themselves just as a human being.
Right.
So what happened in 2014 was really interesting. So we've had a couple of years now of these incredibly aggressive attacks. Groups like Ultraviolet, we went from being nothing, literally we didn't exist, to having close to 600,000 members women and men all across the country who are taking action to defend and expand women's rights. You have groups like Planned Parenthood who have significantly expanded their membership bases. You have NARAL relaunched, as a bastion for fighting for abortion rights. And you have multi-issue organizations like Credo Mobile, for example, Move On, Democracy for America, who are increasingly taking up an anti-sexism, pro-women agenda kind of mantle and expanding their own list as they take these issues on. What we saw was millions more people than had existed, in the previous decade before, who were actively taking action to expand and defend women's rights and hold those politicians and corporations accountable for directly attacking women. So, a good example is Hobby Lobby, where yes, Hobby Lobby is run by a deeply ideological CEO who demonstrated that he really didn't care if he was losing customers. He saw himself as being kind of a warrior in both a religious battle, but also in the fight for undermining the Affordable Care Act. There were no amount of customers who were going to say, "I'm not shopping at your store anymore," that were going to keep him from continuing on with this crusade.
Right.
Okay, but what did happen was millions of people participated in that campaign, and it emboldened the White House to say, okay, look, if you all in the Supreme Court are going to essentially going to collude to undermine women's access to something as fundamental and as broadly needed and accepted and wanted as birth control, we're going to go ahead and fix that problem and make it possible for women, regardless of whether the corporation is trying to deny them access to it or not, can actually get access to free birth control thanks to the Affordable Care Act. That could never have happened had millions of people not made their voice heard on this issue, had it not been made plainly clear that not only the statistics back up that the vast majority of women support and indeed use or have used at some point in their life birth control, but also that it is politically rewarding to defend women's access to birth control.
Right. And I'm glad that you're bringing up, this point that, that we do have the ear of our president, and that we do have the ear of some pretty important political leaders, because I think that we're going to really need their help over the course of this next congressional session, because they just got back from their winter break, and it seemed like item number one on their agenda, or at least pretty darn close to the top of the agenda, was passing a national abortion ban. Can you tell us more about this, and what's going to happen to that bill?
It happens every time Congress turns, right? When Republicans take over Congress, this is, if not the first thing, one of the very first things they do is trying to pass an abortion ban. So, of course, this session being no different. Yes, we have lots of economic.
Yeah, so and some of this is like routine pageantry for sure, and I understand that they that some of the newer members of Congress are trying to score political points with some of their new allies, and then some of the older members of Congress are trying to score those same points with old allies, and I think we know that even if this bill were to somehow pass the Senate, President Obama, is probably not going to be, signing anything like this. But the other place where I guess I'm concerned is where, Congress is going to try to hit reproductive health on the budget. And I think I've heard that there are plans in the work to try to defund Planned Parenthood. And I was wondering, what happens if those budget cuts were to actually take place?
Yeah. Well, let me just back up really quick, just
okay.
to say that on the 20-week abortion ban, it's an abortion ban, and they put 20 weeks on it because they believe that they have a lot of consensus across the party, and they believe that there is public support for a ban at 20 weeks, and that this is going to be some huge galvanizing kind of organizing platform for them. I actually don't think it's just business as usual. I don't think it's just a messaging bill for them. I think they truly believe that they are going to make headway with this one.
Oh, wow. Okay.
That in my mind is what actually was why. Yes, it's business as usual in the sense that they do this every time, but it's actually more dangerous than it has been in the past for that. And so, what I would say is we shouldn't just assume that we're cool because Obama is very likely to have our back. If people are not overtly, directly, and loudly opposing this and negating the assumption that the vast majority of the population in the United States supports the 20-week ban, we could be in very real trouble. So I think. So I just wanted to put that out there before we dismiss it completely. What's interesting is like this is not the only bill we're dealing with right now. They've submitted 6 bills that deal with women's health and deal with undermining women's access to critical health services. Planned Parenthood is, I think, the other. If we were to pull out 2 to focus on, the one would be the 20-week ban because of the political will and dynamic around it right now within the party. But the other, would be this attempt, as usual, but this time with a certain amount of fervor, to defund Planned Parenthood. Now, what they're saying is, right, that they don't name Planned Parenthood, but the net impact is defunding Planned Parenthood completely. This is one of those bills that is completely unnecessary in a sense that it sort of reaffirms that federal funds can't be used for abortion. Okay, that's law.
Right.
That doesn't happen.
Right.
The only reason you would be writing the bill that deals with federal funding is because you are expressly interested in making sure that Planned Parenthood can't get funding from the federal government to provide health services that people in this country can't get anywhere else, certainly not affordably. So it's it's a real threat. In fact, this is these kinds of bills with the right amount of public support and insufficient and insufficient efforts to stop them from moving forward could pretty easily probably pass the House and then the Senate. Not as easily in the Senate, but it's conceivable.
Right.
And like I said, you don't know what kind of political climate you're in once those reach the president's desk. You hope, you want to believe. We know that that the president would do the right thing. Presidents often can be on your side and end up doing the wrong thing due to all kinds of any manner of political calculations that are difficult to predict.
Right.
So
right.
We are in a precarious spot right now. But everybody knew that when we were going into the election, that losing both chambers is going to be a very big deal for health, and here we are.
Right. And and that's the thing that actually kind of scares me the most, I think, is that in the political calculus that that any president, not just President Obama, but any president in this situation would face is that are you willing to starve Peter to feed Paul? And that's and some of these budget things offer very false choices that the president must make. And the fact that he might be told okay, your community college initiative, that sounds great, but how about we pay for it by just defunding Planned Parenthood? And now you've got a president that is facing this ugly situation where he just said something that is pretty darn popular to young people, but now he's also got a program that is really going to suffer if he makes this compromise. So when it comes to those false choices, what would you tell listeners is the best approach as far as getting involved and making their voices heard?
Well, look, it does depend on the issue. So I think at this point in our history and this point in the legislative session, it does make sense to pay attention. It makes sense to participate in campaigns that groups that you trust are running. If one of them is ultraviolet, that means going to weareultraviolet.org and checking out what's happening, seeing what our latest actions are, and reading the emails that we send, which hopefully do a decent job, and we're not the only ones. NARAL does this, Planned Parenthood, Democracy for America, Credo, Move On, a lot of the groups I mentioned at the beginning of this call that hopefully lay out in a clear way what our leverage actually is, what a credible path to victory could look like, and what you can do to participate in that. One of the things that we know needs to happen is that Congress needs to hear from people directly.
Mm-hmm.
People feel, really bad about Congress right now, and for good reason. And it's getting harder and harder. Or I should say, I think people feel less and less inclined to pick up the phone and call their legislator or send their legislator an email. But even in a Republican, and actually I would say especially in a Republican-controlled Congress, whether you live in a Republican or a Democratic district, it's critical that they hear from you, that they hear from constituents on all of this stuff. I also think, and in some of these cases, just trying to get in the way of something passing is just as helpful as as anything else. And so sometimes a non-working Congress can be to women's benefit. Making sure that nothing passes, that the president is not put in that precarious spot, rejecting the false promise. I mean, look, Republicans are very good legislators. They're very good at creating that false promise. False choice. They're very good at setting you up for a decision that is going to be tough and it's going to be pretty harmful to some group of people. Sometimes, and often that group is women.
Right.
So, if you want to treat it as a special interest, like they certainly do. So it's paying attention, it's making your voice heard, and it's helping to stop bad bills from moving. Even if there's something good in it, it's not worth it.
Right. And Shauna, I know that maybe it's a little bit early to be asking because the Supreme Court is hasn't given us too much of an idea of where they're going to stand with some of the decisions that they have to make regarding some of those state laws that you were referring to before. And Tanine Allison is going to guide us on some of that. But do you have any previews of like what's on their docket? Because these justices, they've got a spotty record on reproductive health. I mean, they tell Arizona that they can't tell doctors what to do with medications they use to help women terminate pregnancies. But then, just like you were saying before about they're letting Hobby Lobby try to stop employees having access to birth control. So our justices are not exactly they're like I was saying before, their record is kind of spotty.
It's worse than that. I mean, they give people in the women's rights advocacy space like a heart attack every other week. I feel like they're just I thank God for Ruth Bader Ginsburg, for example.
Oh yeah, gotta love RBG.
Oh, the notorious RBG. We adore her. She won the ultraviolet Femi Award last year for most popular progressive champion for women among our members. She's wonderful. She wrote a scathing critique of the Hobby Lobby decision and really put to words a lot of the way that people were feeling about the restrictions that the Supreme Court was placing on women and their access to birth control. But look, one RBG does not a helpful Supreme Court make.
Right.
So yeah, look, I don't actually know what we're going to be facing specifically this year, but we're pretty focused on Congress at the moment, and hoping the Supreme Court takes the back seat and doesn't try to legislate.
Yeah. Well, when we get closer to those times, I hope we can chat again and and bring our listeners and our audiences and constituents and fellow citizens up to speed about what they can do, and hopefully we'll have some good news to talk about. It's always good to stay optimistic. Shauna, thank you so much for joining us today. If you want to, just plug Ultraviolet one more time so that our audience can get more familiar with your amazing work.
Yes, thanks.
Yeah, please tell us more about the organization, and go for it.
Thanks. So again, we are an online-based organization where we are ultraviolet.org. We have just over 600,000 members in every single state and congressional district. Take action on everything from women's health, women's representation in the media and the corporate boardroom, to domestic violence in the NFL and sexual assault. So we hope you join us to help defeat and expose sexism.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Shauna, for joining us on Dr. America. We really appreciate it. We will definitely have you back again in the near future. And everybody else, we will be right back after these messages. You've been listening to Dr. America. I am your host, Dr. Sanjeev Sriram, and we'll be right back.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.
All right. Welcome back to Dr. America. I am your host, Dr. Sanjeev Sriram. Thank you for joining us. Today we have been talking about reproductive health in America in 2015. Where are the attacks? Where are the opportunities? And what can we do as health justice advocates to do our part to make sure that women's health is protected, that we're making progress where it needs to be made? And, in the first part of the program, we talked about the national perspective. That is, where are our members of Congress and the House of Representatives and the Senate? Where are they trying to take reproductive health policy, and what can we do about it? For this next part of the program, we're going to talk about the states, because so much health policy gets passed in the State House, and not enough of us are involved in keeping our state legislatures accountable. Just a small couple of factoids to keep in mind while we're talking about all this, and that is with public funding of women's health and reproductive health rights. So there are 17 states that use public funds to pay for all or most medically necessary abortions for Medicaid enrollees in their state. 17. 32 states and the District of Columbia prohibit the use of public funds except in those cases when federal funds are available, that is, when a woman's life is in danger, the pregnancy, or if the pregnancy is the result of rape or incest. So there are very, very few states that in our country that allow women to have the full freedom of choice and allow them to work with their doctor to decide what is right for their body. And to help us get a better sense of where states are going or where states are trying to go, I am really pleased to invite our next guest, Ms. Taneen Allison. She is a friend of mine who has been the communications director of Planned Parenthood Texas Votes. It's a statewide advocacy arm of Planned Parenthood in Texas. Previously, she's worked on a diverse collection of progressive communications and organizing efforts, from Brave New Films to MTV to organizing support for passage of the ACA. I'm really excited to have Taneen join us. Taneen, thank you so much for coming on Dr. America, and thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be on.
All right. So, Taneen, I know you're in Texas, and their legislative session is about to start, and women's health is a major, major target. But before we dive into that, I was wondering if you could describe for our audience what advocates and activists accomplished in Texas, including, the work of Wendy Davis and, so many of those activists that we saw in Austin last spring. How did those efforts come about, and where are they now?
Yeah, no, that's a good way to frame it. We are at the start of our new legislative session, and Texas is one of those states where our legislature meets for 6 months every other year. And so the last time the legislature was gathered was it ended in the summer of 2013. So we've had this kind of gap of time since that historic kind of organizing moment. And what I think that, looking at the filibuster and the protest from the summer of 13, what you've seen is that there were enough Texans there's definitely enough Texans who support a woman's right to decide what's best for her health and for her body in her life. But they hadn't really kind of fully ever done it. I mean, nobody had ever gone to the legislature in that amount of force and that amount of power. And so the summer of 13 was this kind of turning point where a lot of people who cared about the issue suddenly got mobilized and took it on in a very strong way to see the importance of showing up. It wasn't just, the one night of the filibuster. There were a couple of weeks there where you could go to the Capitol at 1 a.m., 2 a.m., almost any day, and it would be packed with people in like overflow rooms watching committee hearings at 2 a.m. and like cheering on legislators. I mean, it was an incredible thing to witness as far as what democracy can look like, and particularly in the state where we have incredibly low civic participation rates in any way you look at it. And so that was this huge moment, right? And then, of course, HB2, the bill that Wendy Davis filibustered, got passed into law. But what we saw was that it was such a transformative activism or advocacy experience for people. They were not dissuaded from continued engagement because this one horrible piece of legislation had gotten passed. They wanted to know what to do next. And what we've seen from that is that even more progressive groups in Texas have taken on the issue of access to reproductive health care and reproductive justice, and have continued organizing throughout it. Planned Parenthood Texas Votes, where I work, is an example of that. It had been planned for before that summer, but it hadn't yet been created. And so we, as you said, are the statewide advocacy arm of Planned Parenthood, and we came into being officially last year in March. And so, as an example, we spent 2014 focusing on women voters in particular, and translating what we saw at the legislature into an electoral focus, but always doing that with a sense that we were organizing beyond just an election cycle, that we were really building supporters and educating Texans so that we can continue this fight in the long run. And so with the new legislative session starting, we have more supporters. We have more people who want to get engaged. And at this point, it's the beginning of session, and you have all these people watching who now also know who their elected officials are and how legislation gets passed because they spent so much time being involved in 13. And so even though there's a lot of challenges ahead, I think that what we've done in Texas is build a really strong movement that keeps growing. And the work is to keep people engaged and to find the right ways to apply that engagement to keep pushing for change.
Yeah, and this entire narrative is just so inspiring because I think that for a lot of health policy wonks and I think the civics nerds, this is inspiring because it's so rare when you hear of people like you're saying staying up till 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. to cheer on a legislator in the state house. It's a really empowering story, and I'm really hoping that our audience can kind of realize that if it can happen in places like Texas, there's no such thing as a congressional district that's too red or a township or a part of the country that's too conservative for voices to be heard and to make themselves be heard. So I really appreciate this context for approaching reproductive health at the state level because I hope it keeps us galvanized for activism.
Can I just add one quick thing?
Yes,
on that?
please.
One of the takeaways from the summer of 13 was just, I've been an organizer for a long time period, but that was the most incredible experience I've ever had on organizing. I mean, it was beyond what you could ever expect. But when kind of stepping back from it and looking at what happened, right? Like, why did suddenly the state that had had horrible bills passed before and nobody turned out and nobody paid attention, like, what changed? And one of the key lessons I took from that is that, it started with the people's filibuster, which is when we asked people to show up and have 3 minutes each of public testimony. And if we got enough people to do it, they could go through the night. We were on a very set timeline by which we had to pass the bill, so we were just running down the clock. But it was a very specific ask of, you come, you mean 3 minutes, and you bring people, and we get enough people, and we can win. And so it was a direct appeal. We were, doing some sort of analysis around the advocacy, so we were giving people a way where they truly understood the importance of their being there.
Right, and it's like you're literally putting their voices in front.
Yeah, and I mean, and that was the first night, and then it was monumental that night, and then it kept growing, and all the other days it didn't, maybe necessarily, it wasn't like a 3-minute each thing, when they were watching committee hearings in overflow, but the concept of why engagement matters and really making the ask very clear, I think changed everything, because if you give people a very specific ask and say, this is exactly how you doing this will change the outcome, you see a higher level of engagement. And I think that that's something we don't often think about in organizing, but I think Texas showed that you can pull support in places where you might not expect it if you're strategic about what you're asking people and telling them why it matters.
Right. So, I mean, with with this movement so fired up, I'm curious about the laws that Texas has passed about these. It looks like this big list of physician requirements, hospital requirements, clinic requirements, for providers caring for women. And it seems like the same kind of list of requirements, this onerous, unnecessary set of laws, is making headway in other states. And I mean, what I find frustrating about a lot of this is that it feels so ridiculous to see like such an onerous number of requirements on providers of women's health when we don't see we don't see similar kinds of restrictions on things like, putting Botox poison in people's face, or you can, suck fat out of a person for, with liposuction, but that clinic won't face nearly as much scrutiny or regulation as just providing simple women's health. What's going on with that?
Well, it's a fair and good observation of what's actually happening. I mean, it's funny with Texas, right? Texas is the most anti-regulation state in so many ways. I'm very proud of that, except for when it comes to women's health. And what we're seeing in Texas is a great example, but we are seeing it in so many states across the nation is that, Roe v. Wade is the law of the land. And there's a lot of people who wish that weren't so. And so they can't just pass a bill completely banning all access to abortion because of the law. And so these restrictions are about ways that are focused on closing health centers, particularly in Texas, where, we have such a large state, like geographically large. And when you see where the clinics are closing, because the regulations that you mentioned, they have nothing to do with health, and they're not based on science. It's, asking health centers to spend millions of dollars to change, the size of their hallways or, the door frames, the type of paint on the wall. And, a lot of the smaller health centers can't afford it, but then you also add on top of it the admitting privileges of saying that they have to have admitting privileges at a nearby hospital. And that then further discriminates against women in rural areas who that's not, they can't have a hospital nearby where the admitting privileges are easily accessible. And so we're seeing the rural clinics kind of go out first. And so it's going to be, depending on how this all plays out, there's a lot of court battles about different components of the bill right now. And we're waiting to hear from the Fifth Circuit at this point on some of those. It's really just making it as impossible to access safe and legal abortion in Texas as the legislators can make it. And that's what these restrictions are about.
Wow. Okay. So, I mean, and that actually kind of helps us kind of understand that, these are like real life consequences. And, now it is becoming a situation where you live is going to kind of start determining, the quality and access of women's health. In addition to some of the requirements on the actual physical infrastructure, I think some of the other stuff that I've seen coming out of the states that really bothers me as a doctor is that there's so much non-science that we as doctors are being required to give women in the form of quote unquote counseling. It's like these states are mandating that doctors counsel women with this misinformation. There's 17 states requiring doctors to tell patients things like abortion is a risk factor for breast cancer, which it is not. Abortion causes mental health problems, which is also not true. But these are state laws that are putting misinformation in doctors' mouths. And I guess my question again is, what's the deal with that?
I mean, I think it just goes back to trying to make access to safe and legal abortion as hard as possible, right? Whether it's making a woman drive hundreds of miles each way in Texas, or making the process itself, the waiting period restrictions and the longer time periods and the things that you have to hear that's trying to, scare women with unscientific things that they're now making a doctor say. And I think that it's interesting too, in the framework of the people who pass these bills saying that they're about protecting women. And then you think about the real life harm caused by women going through this experience who have to hear lies essentially from their doctor about what it does to them. And it's all of these laws are cruel when you look at how they impact people, which I think often gets lost in the debate and is an important part of our work, is really telling the stories of what is this experience like now, particularly for women in Texas who don't live near a health center that does abortions at this time. Like, what does this really mean for somebody? And it's a really awful process that legislators have created.
Yeah, and and then I guess on top of all that, we have women being forced to undergo ultrasounds that doctors are not requiring for their patient care, and then there are also states that are requiring women to actually look at the ultrasound while it's being done, and it's like this this attempt to try to instill shame and guilt, and when I look at a lot of this, what I'm curious about is what are some of the ways that our listeners can get involved, because and just in the when we look back at 2014 and just in the first quarter of 2014, we had 38 states introduce something like 300 pieces of legislation to attack women's health, and so if for our listeners who really are caring about a lot of this, what are the best ways to kind of keep track of what's happening where, and so they can spring into action, and they can become better activists, they can support more activists, and maybe even help more Wendy Davises of the United States rise up.
I think an easy way, the simplest way to get updated information and figure out what's going on is to sign up with your local Planned Parenthood that will be tracking what's going on politically in your state and providing options for actions as kind of as an entry point to figuring out just kind of how to get involved and what the options are. But I think that there's so many different ways to take action on this issue, right? So at base level, you need to know what's going on, right? And the power of paying attention and then taking action, whether it's sharing information about what's going on in the legislative cycle, just not letting legislators think that they can do these things without anybody noticing or without anybody calling them on it, right? There's a power in that at large in the legislative process, but then it translates also into the electoral process. We actually saw last year that candidates were not trying to run, even incredibly anti-women's health candidates, we're not trying to lead with that platform. We're shifting it to where that's kind of a dangerous position for politicians to hold, right? And we need to keep making them see that there is a responsibility, they will be held accountable for doing these things, and that we won't let them go quietly doing it, whether it's in the legislative cycle or in the electoral cycle. But I think that talking to other people about these issues and kind of pulling in new activists and new supporters and kind of raising a new generation and training them really in what this work is about is also a crucial kind of thing to keep doing while we are focused on a certain bill or a certain legislative session or a certain election, that we need to kind of keep building our infrastructure as a movement. And another thing that's less direct when you're looking at policies, but an important thing given the Supreme Court case recently, being clinic escorts too is a really important way to kind of volunteer and get engaged and provide support to women who are going through this process, and we'll have sidewalk protesters kind of yelling at them. I can tell you that going into a clinic in Texas on a regular basis just has for me made the issue incredibly real. I go in and I'm safe and I'm at work, but to really understand what the experience is like, I think is useful to kind of keep engaged with that while engaging on the political front. And so I would suggest we always need more escorts around the nation, particularly after the Supreme Court case. So that's another good way to get involved.
Okay, awesome. Well, Tanine, thank you so much for joining us today on Dr. America. I think that you've given us so much inspiration, from the deep in the heart of Texas, and if it can happen there, it can happen anywhere. And I'm really inspired by what you're able to share with us today. And I hope folks take the time to to Google your story and to learn more about everything that Planned Parenthood Texas Votes has done in the last couple of years, and make it happen in their own local communities. Thank you so much for joining us, Tanine.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on.
All right, so we're coming up on the end of the episode, folks. Thank you so much for joining us. I have just, a couple of, small closing thoughts when it comes to reproductive health. I think that one of the things that I'm really proud of to be, in this network that includes activists like Shauna Thomas and Tanine Allison is that, we're able to, talk about reproductive health and women's health issues without making them feel like icky, sticky kind of, subject matters that I think a lot of our politicians in the past have let us down, and, by not, courageously standing up for them. But just like has been pointed out in this episode, when the people are making their voices heard, through so many different forms of media and in person in places like Austin, Texas, it gives support to the Wendy Davises of the world. It gives support to the women of the world who are just trying to make their choices felt and known, and it gives women's health and the overall quality of our healthcare real civic engagement and support that is just what we need to keep our standards of healthcare rooted in science and not misogyny. I'm really proud of the work that Ultraviolet and Planned Parenthood have done so far. We're going to be coming back and tuning into them from time to time. And I want to thank you guys for joining us today. So, without further ado, thank you so much for listening in, and salud to your health.